Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Melbourne's first infrastructure webinar for 2023. We're really excited to have you joining today. My name's Mark Allen, and I am the Director Green Line at the City of Melbourne, and I have the pleasure of being your MC this afternoon for the webinar panel discussion. And our topic today is decarbonising our cities. So let me begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I am making this webinar from, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to also acknowledge any Aboriginal people that are joining us online today. This is the seventh webinar that we have had in the infrastructure series since we began investigating sustainability and resilience back in 2021. And I'm glad there are some familiar faces and we're joining some new experts in the discussion this afternoon. We kicked off in 21 with a range of local and international panelists sharing their views on topics which included building climate resilient infrastructure, circular economy, geospatial challenges and opportunities for a sustainable future, how digital transformation will improve our efforts in sustainability and building city infrastructure. Then in 2022, we looked at integrated design for urban resilient landscapes, challenges and opportunities for resilient infrastructure. If you would like to learn any more about the research and those innovative programs, or to view any of the earlier webinars, please visit the University of Melbourne's website. I need to point out that we are filming and recording this event this afternoon, and the webinar itself will be put up on the Faculty of Engineering and Information Technologies webpage. Uh, it's now an opportunity, and a very pleasant one, to welcome our graphic artist. So we have Zara, our illustrator, who will be scribing today's session. So hello, Zara. I look forward to seeing the output that you capture, which is always fascinating. So very welcome to you. Okay, so today's is a big topic. The built environment accounts for 39% of gross annual carbon emissions worldwide. Within this figure, embodied emissions, which include all the emissions created in producing construction materials, is a significant offender. And that's information from the World Economic Forum. I'm proud that my employer, the City of Melbourne, and also the host of today's webinar, the University of Melbourne, have taken a leadership position in the climate mitigation space, prioritising their opportunities and reporting on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and taking a range of actions in this space. City of Melbourne, through its emissions reduction plan for council operations 2021-26, is looking to reduce emissions and waste, and leading others to do likewise, to protect our public health, strengthen our economy, and manage the cities in ways which mitigate and adapt to climate change. Small but significant recent example of that was a public realm project up in Ferry Street at the Queen Victoria Market, where the council, who lays a lot of concrete and asphalt, let me tell you that, had an opportunity to measure and reduce the amount of embodied carbon, and a reduction of 38% was achieved in relation to concrete, and a 20% reduction in asphalt. That's equivalent, they tell me, to 22,000 kilos of carbon, and that would be enough for a car to drive around the Earth 4 times. So, really quite significant. The University of Melbourne's sustainability plan to 2030 is also a very significant document, launched in May last year. It's ambitious and a collaborative plan. And in its most recent report, the university has taken steps to establish a baseline to facilitate certification as carbon neutral by 2025 and climate positive by 2030. One example from the recent progress report is that across the university's 44 buildings, at least 44 of them, have solar systems installed, equating to over 11,000 photovoltaic panels. These panels generate more than 3,000 megawatts of clean energy on the campuses each year, and this is equivalent to powering 650 homes for a year, and that prevents around 3,000 tons of carbon being released into the atmosphere. So, some really important work that's going on across the tertiary education sector and government and industry. And we look forward to more options to decarbonise our buildings and precincts and cities, and to also look to those solutions that are emerging and how data and tools might play a role in driving data-driven decisions. So, as I mentioned before, today's is a big topic. Cities are complex, and there are actions that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint because we're aware there are multiple products and activities and services that are provided across our cities. But working together, hopefully, we'll be able to come up with some whole of society approaches, both top down and bottom up. And we've got the panel today to unpack some of that complexity for you. So um, we're really pleased to have had a number of questions pre-registered, but we really welcome you and encourage you to interact by typing questions for our panelists into the Q&A box on the right-hand side, or liking the ones that you most want answered. I'll try and address as many of those questions as possible as we go through the webinar. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce the panel. First up, I begin is Lucy Marsland. She's a structural engineer that trained at the University of Melbourne and is a passionate advocate for thoughtful, resilient, and environmentally sensitive buildings that empower and connect people with their communities. So, welcome to you, Lucy. Okay, next up we have Joanna. So Joanna leads the multidisciplinary teams across Australasian region to deliver projects that exemplify Arup's purpose through smart, innovative, sustainable design. With diverse global experience in architecture and engineering underpinned by sustainability principles, Joanna balances the technical problems which she gets to work and solve on each day with a considered understanding of sustainable design solutions. So, welcome to you, Joanna. Okay. We're also very pleased to invite to the screen Ian Dixon. Ian is Technical Director and National Building Sustainability Practice Lead at GHD. He has over 25 years' experience in the built environment and sustainability, and over the course of his career has been involved in the design and construction of a diverse range of major building, precinct, and infrastructure projects. He also has extensive experience in developing sustainability strategy, policy, and advisory, including developing decarbonisation pathways to reach net zero. So thank you for joining us this afternoon, Ian. Next is one of our university experts, our very own Dr. Bezard Rizmanchi. Dr. Bezard is a senior lecturer in the Department of Infrastructure Engineering at the University of Melbourne and is a renowned expert in the field of building energy and sustainability. He has many years of experience in research, design, and optimization of energy systems, and he has established himself as a leader in the industry. So welcome to you, Besard. Okay. And our final panelist, but certainly not last and certainly not least, is Dr. James Halal. Dr. James Halal specializes in life cycle assessment, computer design, structural optimization of buildings also. As Assistant Dean, Sustainability of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne, he is committed to enhancing and realising the strategic direction and sustainability agenda for the faculty. This involves embedding sustainability into research, teaching, learning, culture, and the organisational life of the faculty and the university. So welcome to you, James. Terrific. So I'm going to begin with some questions that were predetermined. And as I said before, please put your questions into the chat space on your computer so that we can respond as the discussion goes along. But the first question is going to go to Bezhard. So, what should be the key focus for designing new buildings and operating existing buildings in order to achieve net zero emissions and address the building sector's significant contribution of global CO2 emissions?
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Mark, for the introduction and the great question. I'm delighted to be here today to discuss this topical context. And I'm glad that your question covered both existing and new buildings. And both sectors contribute to the global emission. As you know, the existing inefficient buildings contribute mostly to the operational emission, as you alluded earlier, while the new buildings contribute toward embodied emission. And I think James is going to talk about that in a sec. We're living in an age where buildings are not just a structure of concrete and glass. They are entities that breathe, consume, and emit, just like us. And we are here to discuss how we can transform these structure into agents of sustainability. The first aspect we need to consider when designing or transforming our buildings is, of course, its envelope or its shell. This shell should not just protect its occupant from the element, but should also do it so in an efficient way. If you're at the moment in Melbourne and freezing cold, just like I am, just imagine if your building could have trapped summer warmth and release it during these chilly winter, or if the structure could utilize natural lighting so efficiently that it could significantly reduce its reliance on artificial lighting. These are not science fiction. It's efficient energy efficient design of a building. And this is a concept that leverage insulation, high performance windows, advanced construction techniques. At the moment, our colleagues in the industry are strong advocates of passive house design that basically relies on these principles. But of course, if we have an energy efficient shell, it's not enough. Our buildings should not only be efficient consumers of energy, but they can actually produce it as well. As you mentioned, what we have done in the University of Melbourne, we have a lot of solar PVs, and the integration of renewable energy sources like solar panels or solar thermal or even geothermal energy into our building design can transform our structure from energy consumers to something that we call energy prosumers. One of the example I can give is one of my areas of work at the moment is a fifth generation district heating and cooling, where we harvest, store, share low grade heat in an urban setup. We're currently working on analyzing these concepts for one of our new campuses at the University of Melbourne. And now, if buildings are going to be prosumers of energy, their internal systems must also match the same principle as well. The majority of the energy used in the buildings are going through the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. And this HVAC system should be designed to maximize energy efficiency without sacrificing comfort. And this has been a very topical and hot issue, especially after the COVID. Advanced heat pump technology, demand control ventilation, and energy recovery can contribute substantially to reduce energy use while improving the indoor air quality. And next come smart automation. You've seen over the news, the automation and AI has revolutionized various sectors of industry. And now it's time to embrace them in the building sector as well. AI-driven building management system can optimize energy use by understanding the patterns of the occupants and the building performance, and provide tailored solution rather than a single solution for all the problems. Currently, my team is working on AI-based algorithm to improve HVAC design to reduce the operational energy demand while improving the indoor air quality. And to go back to your question, in my opinion, to reach our net zero emission goals, we must reshape the way we think about buildings. They're not just shelters; they're living, breathing entities that should be designed and operated with a clear understanding of their impact on our ecosystem. And by doing so, we're not only shaping buildings of future, we are actually building a sustainable future.
That's fantastic, Behzad. Thank you very much for that. You started out by saying it's not science fiction, and then you took us straight to AI-driven building management. So we look forward to that future and a more sustainable one. But thank you for those comments. Now I'm going to turn to Ian. We've got a question for you, and as I look at the question, we can see that Zara is hard at work. Jotting down some of those thoughts so creatively. So we look forward to those. So Ian, here's an easy one for you. How can adoption of circular economy principles in building design lead to embodied carbon reductions across the value chain? That's not an easy question, Ian, but could you take us through that?
I'll do my best. And thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. Also a pleasure to be here today. So decarbonisation, embodied carbon and circular economy are extremely prominent topics within the built environment. Embodied carbon and circular economy both, rightly so, are getting much increased attention and focus from a lot of different parts of the industry, including a lot of work through the Green Building Council of Australia to advance this. But the good news is that by applying circular economy principles, you inherently will achieve decarbonisation. So, circular economy at its heart aims to keep materials in use at their highest value. And this is done through a combination of measures. So, focusing on resource efficiency, designing out waste, extending the life cycle of materials when they're in use, and then more importantly, ensuring that we plan ahead and make sure that we're thinking now what the life of those materials are going to be when they reach the end of their first use. So it means it's really important that we design buildings and other infrastructure now so you can actually deconstruct them and reuse elements at the end of life. And all of these have substantial opportunities to reduce embodied carbon. In the work that we do at GHD, we get involved in the value chain at various stages, but as an organization, primarily a lot of our work comes up front, helping clients determine if a development is feasible, helping them write the brief, and then working through the design stage. So the things that we, will focus on is, helping a client work through and challenge the need to actually construct a new building. If you've got, clients such as universities or large sort of portfolio owners, there's often opportunities to look at repurposing assets, not constructing new assets. That alone can have quite substantial embodied carbon savings of up to 50% compared to constructing new. And then the other key areas through that design stage then is then looking to design in a very lean way where possible and avoid unnecessary use of materials. And where those materials inherently then need to be used, it's giving preference to, bio-based materials from a renewable source or selecting materials with high recycled content, and then looking at that design for future adaptability and future disassembly. One other area that we are involved in, and this is not me personally, this is my colleagues, GHD are involved in a number of industry working groups and research projects, specifically looking at the supply chain side of the equation. So we're involved in MECLA, which is the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. They have a series of subgroups, and what they're working very hard on at the moment is to actually change industry standards. For example, there's a concrete subgroup. They're looking to get Australian standards changed. They're working with clients to change their own performance requirements to allow concrete mixes to have a much higher tolerance for using more elevated quantities of supplementary cementitious materials such as fly ash. And GHD are also involved in a trial with a number of Australian cement manufacturers, looking at both how to transition their energy supplies to become renewable, but more importantly, how to deal with the emissions that occur through the reaction that's caused to create cement. So, yeah, we're involved at many parts of that supply chain, and I think it's quite an exciting time to be part of this industry as we embrace the challenges of embodied carbon and circular economy.
That's fantastic, Ian. Thank you for that. And I wrote that down. Circular economy aims at keeping materials in use. Great to hear how many of the industry peak bodies are involved in that. And your comments around standards and measures is a perfect segue for me to ask James a question. So I'm going to kick off, James, with how do we navigate the challenges associated with variability and uncertainty in embodied carbon calculations? And then, having answered that, I'm then going to ask you, and most importantly, how can we integrate embodied carbon analysis seamlessly into the decision-making processes to ensure more sustainable and carbon efficient design choices are made? So would you please offer your thoughts on those topics?
Thanks, Martin. Hello, everyone. Look, last night I received just a WhatsApp message from a friend taking a snapshot of an online tool. I haven't checked it out, but it's called Carbon Trace, and they've got a frequently asked question page. And on that, one of the questions is, which carbon coefficient database do you use? And they start their answer with, there are few certainties in life, death, taxes, and disagreement about carbon coefficients. So I thought that was a good place to start this discussion today, because it really highlights the challenge that there's a lot of complexity and uncertainty in embodied carbon calculations. To the average person, this process is quite simple. You begin with material quantities, and you multiply those quantities by embodied carbon coefficients. So these are coefficients that quantify the amount of CO2 equivalent emissions per kilogram, per square meter, per cubic meter, whatever unit your quantities have. You multiply the two and you get the embodied carbon total amount. But anyone who has done this exercise would have noticed that there is no shortage of embodied carbon databases. And if you compare different values, you'll notice a lot of variability. So I think the first step of navigating this complexity and uncertainty is to really understand the underlying methods that are used to calculate embodied carbon coefficients, because as it turns out, method matters when it comes to embodied carbon. And if I can just take 30 seconds, I'll just quickly explain what those methods are before answering your second part of the question, Mark. So basically, there are a spectrum of methods. On one side, there's process-based analysis. So this is bottom-up analysis. And on the other side of the spectrum, it's input-output based. So this is top-down analysis. And there's a bunch of hybrid approaches in between. Basically, with a bottom-up approach, processes are mapped, and we try to quantify the amount of energy and greenhouse gas emissions associated with every step of the manufacturing process for a product. So that's process-based. The problem with that is it's incomplete. It's quite accurate in what we measure, but what we don't measure is quite large, actually, because it's impossible to map supply chains that are highly complex. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's the input-output method that basically looks at economic activity and tries to be comprehensive in that way, but then loses specificity. And hybrid approaches try to combine the strength of all of these approaches. So why did I spend so much time explaining these? Because again, I think navigating this uncertainty requires a good understanding of these methods. But equally important, I think we all have to commit to transparency in our approaches to embodied carbon calculations. We need to share data sources, methodologies, the assumptions used in our calculations. And really only then can we foster trust and comparability in this space so that we can ultimately reduce embodied carbon calculations. And just a quick note on our last question. So how do we go from data to decision making? I mean, we can spend the next hour just talking about that, but I think the key is to start as early as possible in the design process, perhaps not get too caught up in the complexity of the methodologies. We can stick to some first principles. Ian touched on circular economy principles. We can add the dematerialization principles. and of course a solid understanding about the calculations we're doing. So I'll leave it there, but I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about these topics later.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, James. You've certainly unpacked some complexity, which we will all benefit from. So thank you again. I won't repeat your poor joke, but I did make a note that there are no shortage of databases. So I guess what you're suggesting is that we work together to understand what they are transparently, and then make some informed choices, which is all good. Now, Joanna, the question that I have for you, you lead Arup's education business across Australasia. What are universities doing as they're an integral part of cities, and how are they decarbonising their campuses?
Perfect. Thank you for that, Mark, and lovely to be here with my fellow panelists and those on the call. Yes, absolutely right. So I look after Arup's education business, which gives me the incredible privilege to spend a lot of time with universities who, in my view, are the most daring, the most creative, but also the most successful clients when we're talking about pushing the sustainability boundaries. And let me talk a little bit about why I see a lot of similarities between cities and universities, and also what are the trends that we're seeing in the education space, and I guess how cities and other sectors really can learn from the education sector. So firstly, let me share a couple of commonalities. So I'm talking often, or I think what's often missed or not quite well understood is the sheer size of universities in Australia, but also New Zealand. So Australia and New Zealand alone, there are about 60 tertiary education organisations, and together they occupy more than 50 million square metres of space. I know this is a pretty abstract numbers, but when you think of it, City of Melbourne office space is about 5.3 million square metres. So universities across Australia and New Zealand occupy 3 times the office space of CBD, City of Melbourne office space. Another big commonality I see between the university sector and cities is the diversity in typology. So most universities, their spaces range from anything between residential accommodations to large technical teaching spaces, very high-tech laboratories, and then again from car parks and sport fields to libraries. Again, that diversity around typology, very much what you see in a city as well. Another commonality is the aging assets. So a lot of universities have a large stock of aging assets, and of which typically dates before or pre-1980s. And what is also a commonality is that these assets are typically fully occupied, which makes it, to be honest, quite difficult to retrofit during operation. Again, this is a big problem I think a lot of cities and the private sector is being faced with as well. One more commonality is very ambitious decarbonisation targets. And I know, Mark, you briefly touched on it earlier. So most universities have committed to typically being fully decarbonised within this decade. Some are already carbon neutral certified, and some have commitments around 25, 29, 2030, you name it. Some universities also started talking about scope 3 emissions, not all of them. And I think that is a really interesting space, especially when we're talking about embodied carbon here. Some also have 100% renewable energy commitments, so moving completely away from gas. And I think, again, this is a really interesting space when talking both about embodied carbon and operational carbon. Okay, these are my commonalities. So let me move into some differences that make it either easier or more difficult for universities to decarbonise. So the first one is around governance. I mean, a big advantage of universities, they're typically one single owner. So that removes the split incentive, which is typically experienced in the commercial sector between the landlord and the tenant. So that's a big pro. Another big pro I would say is usually around funding. So typically universities have pretty high credit ratings due to their low risk. However, there's also a bit of a negative link to it, because what that means is that the lower interest rate is not linked to any greater sustainability outcomes. I'm talking here about the green bonds and so on. So in a way, it's kind of, it's positive that money can be accessed easier, but it's also a negative because these, I guess, the sticks as in the private sector don't quite apply. Another difference is around reporting requirements. So in the commercial sector, I think we've seen, especially since GRESB rating came into the industry, a lot of requirements, again, for the commercial sector to report on their emissions and what they're doing in the sustainability space. That's not quite the case yet in the education space. I would say most of the commitments and targets are really of voluntary nature. What is interesting, so is I'm not sure if people on the panel or the audience have followed much what's happening with the ISSB standard, the International Sustainability Standards Board, bringing the requirement in to not only report on emissions or emission reductions as part of the ANGA reporting, but also more broadly around sustainability related risk targets, plans and resources for how to deliver on those. So I think this is going to be a really interesting space. Again, in summary, lots of commonalities, lots of differences, but I wanted to briefly touch on some of the emerging trends, which I think are really important for cities and other sectors as well. So first one being around electrification. So the big question has always been central versus decentralized systems, but I think what we're seeing a much bigger appetite for a hybrid version of both. Then the other question around electrification, fully funded by the university or with an external partner. And again, that applies to other sectors as well. And then also whether these go hand in hand with other retrofit strategies. What we're seeing, and Mark, you touched on the achievements for the University of Melbourne around solar panels. Truth is, most universities have completely maxed out the opportunities for on-site renewable energy and are now moving towards power purchase agreements for 100% renewable energy. A lot of experiments have happened around the battery space, but again, I think we've learned it's just the sheer demand around energy. There's rarely ever a surplus on energy available, so batteries don't quite stack up for the university, at least not the chemical batteries, but maybe thermal storage. Scope 3 emissions. An interesting report recently came out from my UK counterparts looking again at the education sector. They found Scope 3 emissions are up to 8 times greater than the sum of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. That is massive. I think it kind of puts a light on, I guess, what we're trying to achieve here in the built environment space, but really the problem is much bigger than that. And I guess, touching on Scope 3 emissions, one of the original questions of this panel is around data. And I think it just highlights again, we don't even know what emissions we're dealing with. It is so difficult to track and understand Scope 3 emissions. And that is from all project stages, the early decision whether to build at all, up to operation. And then the last point I wanted to touch on is circular economy. That's definitely a big trend we're seeing also in the education sector. And again, working with a number of clients here. And a short plug for the Arab Circular Buildings Toolkit if you haven't seen it. And what I love here about this Buildings Toolkit is the 4 strategies around build either nothing, build for long term, and build efficiently, and build, of course, with the right materials. But I feel like the circular economy conversation at the moment very much focuses on the materials, whereas I think we need to start even earlier than that. And there's the question, what do we actually need to build? So yes, in summary, lots of commonalities, lots of differences, and I think a lot cities and other sectors can learn from the education sector and the universities like the University of Melbourne pushing the boundaries on sustainability matters.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Joanna, for such a comprehensive answer, and a lot of themes that are sort of coming through with the way your fellow panelists have made of that. And we do need to find ways to measure performance. And I know the University of Melbourne were very pleased earlier this week, or it might have been last week, that there's been some adjustment to the way university rankings are made. And I think the University of Melbourne is number 14, which is a great credit to the school. So our final question is for Lucy, and that is in this section. And then we have got some questions that are coming through from participants in the webinar, and we'll get to those in a minute. But for you, Lucy, what is the role of the design process and timing of engagement to facilitate decarbonisation for cities and other projects? So another big question, but I'm sure you're up to it.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the question. And the theme is already coming through that timing is everything, and the power of early integration, I think, and what all the panelists have spoken to I see three big opportunities in the work that I do to focus on the way we work and the way we design, as well as what we design. The first one is at Atelier 10, we try and get on projects as early as possible. Optimization can only take us so far in a business as usual design process where engineers and sustainability consultants are coming on to optimize a design. Rather, the greatest outcomes come, as Johanna says, from guiding the vision, the aspiration, and understanding the needs of a community in which the project is placed. So that early engagement is absolutely step one to great outcomes in the design of sustainable built environment. The second piece is industry capacity, and building on what Ian spoke of, I contribute to the Materials Embodied Carbon Leadership Alliance, where there's a focus on advocacy and capacity building for clients, for governments, city councils, and project teams to understand the feasibility, the readiness of our supply chains, to build confidence in making decisions around sustainability, and also supporting decision makers to pledge their commitments. And we see that from the City of Melbourne and the University of Melbourne in their sustainability plans. The final bit, I think, is starting early. And again, we come to university's role as a place of learning and training. So I contribute to the Melbourne School of Design's architecture studios, where we host integrated design studios, bringing engineers and architects around the same table to break down those silos, work collaboratively, and co-create for better sustainability outcomes. And that way, the students that are coming through and soon becoming emerging professionals can be change makers and can bring their enthusiasm and aspirations and ambitions around sustainability into industry, so we can make those highest value changes through our designs.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that considered response, Lucy. And I think we'll all agree that those concepts of integration, and particularly getting creative engineers and creative architects working together on those sustainable solutions is something we all encourage and look forward to the outcomes. So we can see there. Another creative in Zara is capturing thoughts as we speak. But now we're getting a lot of questions that are coming through, which is great. And we have some predetermined questions. So I'm going to try and be fair and answer as many questions as we can. Some of them have some recurring themes. So I see there's a question from Jared around opportunities and challenges for developers to specify upfront carbon targets, and that actually closely aligns with a pre-registered question that we received around top tips for property developers to reduce upfront carbon. So tell you what, I might ask Ian, do you want to share your thoughts on those responsibilities for property developers and how they can make a difference?
Sure can. Yeah, I think one of the key things is you've got to want to deal with embodied carbon and decide that's the path you're going to take at the beginning of the project and get it into your briefs. I see a lot of projects where clients are not asking for that initially, and then what happens is you end up dealing with embodied carbon primarily because the client's pursuing a rating tool, or the design team are trying to sort of instill some best practice on the project. That's not the case for all. There are many people out there who do ask for upfront carbon reductions and measurement of that through the design process. From a client perspective in GHD's world, Transport for New South Wales and New South Wales government have been doing that for quite a long time now. So they require carbon, both embodied and operational, to be measured at each part of a design stage and use the outcomes of that to actually drive design decisions. And they've recently brought carbon even further down the value chain, and it's now a material part of business case development for major infrastructure projects in New South Wales. Other people that are doing it well, some of the big tier one contractors are starting to deal with carbon. That's because they're looking at their scope 3 emissions and not just dealing with scope 1 and 2. So the value there is that you're enhancing your social license to operate. You're addressing shareholder and investor concerns, which is also shifting towards scope 3. But yeah, I think fundamentally it's about deciding early, setting targets, set realistic targets as well. If you want to achieve 10% reduction, that can be done through material substitution. If you want to go more than sort of 40% reduction, you're really looking at having to reuse an existing asset to get that sort of reduction in place without having to rely on carbon offsets.
Fantastic. James, I might get you, if you would, thank you, Ian, but I'll get you also just to touch on the question around tips for developers, but specifically, if you could perhaps talk a little bit about, how do you get the designers working on the targets and then find a way for the builders to deliver that? So that, I think, was the second part of Jared's question. We thank him for that. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think I'll echo what Ian was saying, but I think when developers specify upfront carbon targets, in a way, designers design accordingly and builders commit to delivery. So it's as if, developers are those front car in a Formula One race, or a cyclist where they're pushing a hole in the air, and then they create a path of least resistance. And then there's a lot of opportunities for them to do so. It could lead to a lot of innovation and differentiation, potential cost savings, because lowering embodied carbon can be largely achieved through dematerialization. There's advantages when it comes to regulatory advantages, perhaps not now in Australia, but that's on the horizon. So they could set themselves up quite well to meet future regulations. But of course, that comes with challenges. We talked about those challenges earlier. Data and expertise is a big sort of challenge. But just let me focus on one thing we were talking about earlier when it comes to uncertainty and complexity in embodied carbon. Just because there's complexity and variability doesn't mean there is no right or wrong, or there is no better or worse methods. There often are, but to identify those, you need expertise in addition to the data. But I'll leave it there, I think.
No, listen. Thank you very much for that. That's incredibly helpful. Now I'm going to go to a question from Gary. So thank you, and it's a question for Behzad, and you're going to have to help me out here. So the question is, which of the two is more sustainable? Living, breathing entities. I'm very, very interested to hear about those, or shelters. So Behzad, do you want to tackle that one?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Thank you. And I think there was another question also from Fiona. I think we can talk about that one as well.
Please do.
But this is very, very interesting question. What I think we need to go back to the definition of the sustainability. And I think sustainability doesn't mean we just use less energy. The idea is to use energy smartly while enhancing the service level inside the building. And I think a shelter we've seen a track record during the COVID. It basically failed to provide a safe environment for us. We couldn't rely on just a shelter to do that. But then living, breathing entity are designed to be energy efficient, adaptive, and resilient, while just shelters are providing a space for and protection. So that's we need to understand how the dynamic between the definition of the sustainability work. And I think just following on that, I saw in the question another question from Fiona, that does this translate to infrastructure such as rail, road, energy to be also living entities? And I think absolutely yes, this analogy can also translate to any infrastructure, right? Road, rail, or energy or water systems as well. These infrastructure also interact with their environment. So for example, for the water, I highly encourage people to go and check University of Melbourne One Basin CRC activities, where we are actually trying to see how water system and water utilities can also work with their environment and enhance the sustainability around that one. So I'm going to stop here, and I know we are short in time.
Thanks, Faisal. That's really good, because we are getting some really fantastic questions, and I'm trying to get to as many of them as I can. I'm going to combine a couple and ask Joanna perhaps to talk about, there's a theme coming through, and clearly for those that are involved in property and construction and development as well, is that how do we manage the risks associated with with the measurement and the implementation of strategies to address decarbonisation. So, Joanna, can you give us your insights into procurement and managing some of those risks?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess what we're seeing, look, the industry we're in is so rapidly evolving, and I guess what that inherently brings along is a lot of unknowns and a lot of risks. You know, whether we're talking embodied, with a focus on embodied carbon, whether we're talking existing buildings, the truth is there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, as we're hearing, I think, from all panelists. And I guess in a contractor's words, uncertainty means risk, and risk means cost. What we've seen, especially when retrofitting existing buildings, there are a couple of things I'd like to touch on, and maybe share some recommendations, whether it's consultants or contractors or clients on the call. What we're seeing is the need for a more detailed level of documentation, because the truth is the better documented, the better detailed, whether we're talking buildings, whether we're talking infrastructure, again, whether we're talking a specific part of the building, is that certainly de-risks a project, both for the client but obviously for the contractor as well. Talking contract, I think what we also need to acknowledge is we can't assume using exactly the same procurement approach, including the contract, despite trying to deliver completely different, again, buildings or infrastructure. I think we need to be a little bit more creative, and also acknowledge, Lucy touched on it prior, a significant greater level of involvement at the start of the project rather than towards the end. So I guess how do we include that into the contracts that we're setting up? And one thing I've strongly been advocating for in the past is a view towards a more sharing of pain and also sharing of gain contracts. So how do we incentivize, I guess, innovation? How do we incentivize change along the way? And how do we incentivize doing the right thing rather than just looking at penalizing and putting the responsibility on one single entity, again, typically the contractor? And another really important one, in my view, is we need a new definition of quality and aesthetics. And what we've seen, especially when working with existing buildings or even existing products, so we spoke about circular economy, where we're strongly encouraging buildings projects, or again, infrastructure projects to reuse existing buildings. The reality is we will not get the same look, the same feel with those existing buildings or existing products. So we can't have it both. We can't have reused and refurbished and new at the same time. So maybe the focus needs to be more on character and uniqueness rather than on brand new and flawless. And again, I think that's an adjustment that needs to happen within the industry, not only with the client, but also the consultants and the designers. So these would be my recommendation when navigating
character and
unknowns.
Character and aesthetics. Let's see more of it. Thank you, and I apologise for talking over you. But I'm going to ask Lucy. We had a question that we received prior to the start of the webinar, and I'm going to combine it with the question, and I don't see a name there, but there's a question about business case. But can you please, Lucy, talk to the best ways to justify, support, or advocate for low carbon solutions when there might be no direct initial payback, and what some of the I guess the benefits of making those investments might be from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that Johanna's just opened us up to questioning everything, and the business as usual just it does need to be challenged. And I think that's both around these ideas of look and feel. I think it's around what we call fit for purpose. I sometimes feel I want to challenge when we use fit for purpose as a reason to make design decisions. But also I think in the question around business case and payback, I think there's an assumption in there as well for us to challenge as an industry and shift the way we work and think about the built environment. We use the language of assets and payback, these very, these business terms, and I think there is a more holistic, whole of life and ecosystem approach to consider assets in the built environment. So rather than looking at the payback, where a solar panel, it's very easy to describe the payback in grid energy avoided over a number of years. But when we start thinking about adaptive reuse and refurbishment, or lower embodied carbon products, it's a much more complex question, and it makes you think, well, maybe that's not the right question to be asking. Maybe we need to think rather about investment in the community, and a broader look at what the benefits, the value in a holistic sense is of these assets. And that means bringing in more experts into the conversation. I think our social, our economic, and other community-oriented consultants can help us quantify these things that are treated as externalities, so we understand the health value of more sustainable buildings, or the economic value of more vibrant, enjoyable places. So I think we do have to challenge business as usual and look out to the bigger picture and the ecosystem that we're all working and living in.
That's fantastic. Thanks for that. And listen, there's some really good themes there, and I'm sure with our stellar panel, I mean, I might even just sort of pick up on one of those themes, Lucy, and that's around. Maybe ask you, James. Is there work going on to look at how we might measure adaptive reuse of buildings? I mean, Lucy makes some excellent points there about combining some of the social sciences with a triple bottom line approach. But anything you might be able to add there?
Yes, I mean, we're currently involved in a project to develop guidelines on rebuild versus reuse decision making that happens quite early on in these projects. It is quite complex, though. As you said, there's the triple bottom line of the social, the financial, the environmental. On top of that, you've got risk, which has been a topic of today. On top of that, you have the retrofitability of existing projects. Some projects are well suited for retrofit, others are not. So there is quite a lot of research happening at the university level in collaboration with industry, but it remains an open question, I think.
Yeah, and maybe to you, Ian, do your clients see value in that uniqueness and that aesthetic that might come from from an existing building that you might not be able to drive from a new build?
Sometimes not always, and I think the challenge is there's a lot of practitioners within industry who drive certain decisions based on certain economic models, and they're very well established economic models. So, for instance, if you try and factor a circular economy into a business case, I think the current economic model of looking at an asset is you depreciate the value of that asset, and that depreciation then bumps up your profit margins. It comes off as a cost. So in order to value things at the end of their life or during their life, we have to change. I think the economic model is one thing, and I think that's going to be a very slow thing to change. I think there are some clients out there that are definitely going to be leading this space. GHD have got a current engagement with a major global retailer. I can't divulge who it is, but they are actively looking at their retail stores on a global level in terms of how they currently construct them from a whole of life carbon and a circular economy perspective. And what we're about to do is help them design new stores. And part of that conversation is about what should these buildings be made out of now in order to have the most value at the end of their life, and how does that get costed into a project. So it definitely is happening. I just think it's not currently yet in the mainstream.
Fantastic, thank you. So there's a question from Karina, thank you, about the environmental liabilities of the city caused by pollution. How would they be controlled, such as the smoke and the disused heating system? So, Pesat, do you want to take a stab at that one, and then we might even follow up with Joanna might have some views on that topic as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the disused heating system, of course, basically the energy that is waste from one building, which at the moment is going to the atmosphere. We're not using that. We're just heating up the environment. So that contributes to the urban heat island. There's a lot of question that there's a lot of research going toward that end. But of course, there's a way when we look at the buildings as an entity, when we look them at the city as connected infrastructure, then there is a lot of opportunities then where we can use, for example, a waste heat from one building as a source for another one. These conversations, of course, going back to the conversation that we had earlier, of course, Joanna mentioned about that. There's a lack of policy at the moment in that area, especially in the heat transfer, especially when we're talking about moving a waste heat from one entity across a border or across a road to the another one. So there's a lot of area that needs a government to actually step in and create those clear guidelines, clear policies. So Joanna mentioned it earlier that, for example, in the case of universities, it's much easier to implement because there's a single user, there's single owner. Whereas in the city, there's multiple users, multiple owners, and it's very difficult. Now we are having a lot of conversation about how actually we can use, for example, solar PV in the common areas in top of residential sectors. This does not a clear answer on that one. So we're at the moment working very closely with the government to see how actually we can open up a conversation in order to get to a common area where we can actually set up a good policies that can mitigate these actions as well.
Fantastic, thank you. So, Joanna, can you perhaps talk to that topic if you've got some comments to make, but weave in a response to Paul's question, which is something that Bezhard alerted us to, and that is about the who will be driving the change, the legislation and investment and understanding the returns.
Happy to. I'm not quite sure if I've got Paul's questions. I'm not sure I've got a lot of questions, but
I'll read it.
Let me
Do you want to read
maybe
it?
add. Yeah.
So it was.
Why don't I just one comment to what Bezant mentioned. Obviously, as a sustainability consultant, we get involved again in whether it's buildings works, whether it's infrastructure work, whether it's master planning work, and especially when we're talking about master plans, i.e., big city shaping projects. I often tend to joke we don't need sustainability consultants. Really, what we need here is governance consultants, because exactly as you said, Bezard, is from a technical perspective, there's so many opportunities at that bigger city level in terms of sharing resources, sharing energy, and so on. But the complexity to be resolved here is really the governance and the ownership and the responsibility around that. So, any governance consultants on the call? Keen to hear from you.
It's a very good that's a very good response, but I appreciate you tackling that's a hard one. We have a question there about decarbonisation initiatives that are national goals for the education sector. I'm curious to understand how or why different universities have different targets. Do you want to make a couple of quick comments on that, and then Lucy might have a view as well.
I guess why do different universities have to have different targets? I think it all comes down to the business case. However mature or immature maybe that business case was. I mean, the beauty is around those targets. Many of these targets were actually set without a strong business case behind those targets, without fully understand what it will cost, what it will take, and how long it will take to achieve that. It was very bold of many universities to say, yes, absolutely, we're doing this, and we'll figure out how to get there further on. So that's why in my opening statement I said universities tend to be the most courageous clients. So that's why we love working with them.
Fantastic. Lucy, any thoughts on that just to close?
Yeah, I think a pincer move is always good. Let's go top down and bottom up at the same time. Let the legislation come down and have that grassroots action come at the individual scale, whether it's for universities or other decision makers in the private sector or the public. I also think that the other reason we need that pincer move is that its emissions today are having that environmental impact today. So we can't wait. Anything that we can do today is a great outcome, waiting for things to come down.
Fantastic. The pincers are about to move on me, Lucy, so I'm going to bring it to a close because we have unfortunately come to the end of our time, and I really appreciate, on behalf of the panel in the infrastructure platform from the University of Melbourne, I want to thank our panel today for their wonderful contribution and the discussion. So thank you again, Lucy, Joanna, Ian, Bezhard and James. Thank you to our illustrator, Zara. What a great way to capture today's discussions and learnings. And I'd also like to thank, importantly, you, the audience, for all your questions and interest on this really interesting and very important topic. We'd really appreciate your input on the post-event survey, which will be located in the bottom of this video stream and with the Q&A chat box. So please do that. We value your feedback to help us shape the future of the infrastructure webinar series. And it now just comes to me to thank everyone involved. Please stay safe and have a great day. And thank you once again.